Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, we got a great show for you today. I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today. But, as you can see, if you prefer to watch God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. If you prefer a video format, you can do that on Rumble, /C/TBTRN. If you prefer a podcast format, then just please go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, truthbetoldnetwork.org, and then click on the podcast tab, and that will take you to icons for the 12 major podcast platforms that we're on, and then just click on one of those, go there, and you can subscribe or, do it however you want. And then if you prefer more of a radio or just straight audio format, you can go to the Truth Be Told Network website and just click on the Listen Live button. And that's how you can access not only my show, but all of the great shows on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. So that's just a little bit of how to find God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Now, like I said, very excited about today's show. We are going to look at a really cool section of Scripture. It's a very important segment of Scripture, very well known, very much loved by Christians of all shapes and sizes, shall we say. It's Matthew chapter 16, and this is a very significant section of Scripture, but it's also a source of significant debate. And this is a section of Scripture where it's really a test of one's hermeneutics, and hermeneutics it's a fancy word that means interpretation. This will really test your interpretive skills, and it will also expose your interpretive skills. In other words, when I hear someone speak about Matthew 16, I have a pretty good idea where their interpretive skills lie, whether they're good at it, bad at it, in between, whether they're using proper hermeneutical tools, proper hermeneutical processes, and things like that. But this is the section of Scripture where Jesus and the disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, and he asks them, who do you men say that I am? That's the section that we're talking about. Now, for those of you that may not have ever heard my show before, this is God Save the King. And in God Save the King, I spend a lot of time talking about the Nativity, but we have been talking a lot about identity lately. And that's frankly what we're going to be doing again today in this section of Scripture. Okay, in this section of Scripture, we're going to be looking at identity. But I did want to let you know, for my regular listeners and for those of you that might be new, I spend a lot of time talking about the Nativity. That's what God Save the King is about. God Save the King is a pun, right? It's a play on words, because at the time Jesus was born, Herod the Great was the Roman appointed king of the client kingdom of Judea, whereas Jesus being born was the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the king, and the legitimate King of Israel. So therefore, the phrase God Save the King, that's a method of extolling the king. We see it in Scripture. We have seen it throughout history in countries around the world where the court of the king will say, "Oh, great king, live forever, long live the king," or "God save the king," right? That is a way of extolling the king. And so that's what this is. But it's a play on words, because which king do I mean? Do I mean the Roman appointed client king of Judea, who undoubtedly had yes men surrounding his throne and saying, "Oh, great king, live forever, God save the king"? Or do I mean Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the legitimate King of Israel, the true-born King of Israel, God save the King, and the fact that Herod tried to kill him? So we're coming into that time of year where it's a really good time to discuss the Nativity, because this is the traditional time that we celebrate the Nativity, even though he was not born at this time, which makes this a good time to discuss it and why it's important. So I want to let my listeners know that coming up over the next several weeks, I will be getting back into talking about the Nativity and looking at it through, very, very different viewfinder, right? What I have discovered over about 40 years of research into the Nativity is that, unfortunately, the traditional Nativity story that we are so used to, it is just riddled with biblical and historical errors, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. It's become this story that, a lot of people love the story, and my intention is not to rain on their parade, but it's really not what the Bible teaches. And what the Bible teaches is really, truly an amazing story. So my objective with God Save the King is to retell the story the way it really would have happened, and, really breathe, frankly, new life into it and go, wow, what an amazing story this is. But that's coming up. We're going to be going back to that over the next few weeks. But today, Matthew 16, a new look at Matthew chapter 16. So let me read verses 13 through 19. These are the verses that are in view. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 19. And I'm reading from the New King James Version. So here we go. It reads, "When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, 'Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?' So they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter answered and said, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' Jesus answered and said to him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven.'" Verse 18, "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So this is the section we're talking about, and there are a bunch of really significant, powerful themes that are packed into this, half a dozen verses here. You've got the question, who do men say that I am? Jesus's question, and then, by implication, our answer, our confession of who Jesus is, right? It's as if Jesus is asking the question, who do you say that I am? Okay, well, how do we answer that question? So that's a major theme in this section. Another major theme is that Simon gets his name changed, okay? In verse 17, he is Simon. In verse 18, he is Peter. Simon Peter gets his name changed. Jesus is calling him out and changing his name, okay? Then you have the theme of, on this rock, I will build my church. Now, for the moment, I want to emphasize build my church. We're going to come back to on this rock. On this rock is going to be a huge feature of what we talk about today. But for the moment, just burning through the major themes here, there's who do you say that I am? There's Simon gets his name changed to Peter. And then you have that on this rock, I will build my church, emphasizing build my church for the moment. Then you have this statement about how the gates of hell or the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Another major theme. And then you have keys to the kingdom. And then you have binding and loosing. So you've got at least 6 or 7 major themes here, if not more, all crammed into this half a dozen verses. And now we need to unpack this because there is so much stuffed in here. But then if that weren't enough, there's also significant debate that surrounds this section, and specifically verse 18. And verse 18 is widely recognized among biblical scholars and biblical commentators as containing a literary device or a figure of speech, and that therefore what the question boils down to is who or what is this rock? Because verse 18, let's repeat it here real quick. Verse 18 reads, Jesus speaking, to Peter says, "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." So the question boils down to, what is this rock? What do we mean by that? What did Jesus mean by that? What does the Bible mean when it says this rock? Okay. Now, there are predominantly two opinions what this means, what this rock is referring to. Now, I say predominantly two because there's actually a few more, but there's two main ones and then two or three additional ones, right? So number one, predominant opinion number one is that this rock is Peter, that this is a turn of a phrase that flips it back onto Peter, that I say unto you, you are Peter, and upon this rock, meaning that the rock is Peter, I will build my church. So that is one opinion. And I'll explain more of how we get that opinion in a minute. And then another predominant opinion is that this rock is actually Jesus, where Jesus is in effect saying, well, I say unto you, you are Peter, but upon this rock, meaning himself, I will build my church. And that is based upon the fact that all through Scripture, both Old Testament and New, you have Christ being referred to as the rock and being referred to as the chief cornerstone, right? So that's where we get that one. Like I said, I'll explain how we get Peter being the rock in a minute, but how we get Jesus being the rock, that's pretty self-evident if you're at all biblically familiar. If you know Scripture at all, it's pretty easy to see where we get the idea that Jesus is the rock. But these are the two predominant opinions. Number one, that the rock is Peter, this rock equals Peter, and then number two, this rock equals Jesus. Okay, but now there's a couple more interpretations that I want to tease you with, and then we'll start getting into the detail and getting into the explanation of where do we get these ideas from, and then what are we to conclude and what are we supposed to do about it, right? So here's interpretation number three, or opinion number three, that this rock is actually a reference to Peter's declaration of faith, because Peter's response to when Jesus asks his question. See, the first thing that happens is that Jesus asked this question to his disciples, right? Now it says he asks the group, who do men say I am? In other words, what is, your average everyday Joe out there? When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples saying, who do men say that I am? So who does everybody say that I am, right? And they said, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And that phrase, one of the prophets, is kind of a veiled reference to Moses, that he's somehow Moses, right? And then also including the potentiality of other prophets as well. But this is really interesting because apparently people are having a hard time with this. Now, that's not utterly misunderstandable, right? It's understandable that this, itinerant preacher shows up and all around Israel, Judea and Galilee, and he's preaching. It's like, okay, well, who is this guy, right? And frankly, that's part of what this is addressing, is that if you're going through this in your head and in your heart and going, who is this Jesus, right? Who do men say that I am? Well, some say, there's different opinions. Well, some people say this, some people say that, some people say this. So then Jesus gets a little more focused, right? He actually gets a lot more focused. And he says, okay, well, that's what they say, but now what do you say? What do you say, right? But who do you say I am? Now, this is interesting because he's not focused on Peter exclusively yet. He is still asking the group. He's not asking Peter. He's asking the group, but it is Peter that speaks up, right? And this is one of those moments where Peter shines. Now, Peter is known for putting his foot in his mouth. As a matter of fact, he's going to put his foot in his mouth, back in his mouth, right after this, right after he removes it for a minute. He's going to put it right back in, okay? But this is one of those moments where Peter really shines, because Simon Peter answered and said, "You are Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the anointed one, the Son of the living God," right? So Peter nails it. He nails it. He gets it exactly correct. And then Jesus, responds and says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar Jonah," which means Simon, son of Jonah, "for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Now, this is a key distinction in what we're going to talk about, because it's how did Peter come to the understanding that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So we go back to our dominant interpretations, our dominant opinions of what is this rock, right? That this rock is A, Peter, B, Jesus, C, Peter's confession of faith, or D, which is essentially a variation of C, that this rock is the revelation knowledge of who Jesus is. Okay, so let me run through that again just for emphasis. Now we're up to four dominant opinions, four primary opinions, right, of who or what this rock is, right? So number one is that this rock is Peter. Number two is that this rock is Jesus himself. Number three is that this rock is Peter's confession of faith. But then number four, a little more detailed, is that this rock is the revelation knowledge followed by confession of who Jesus is, right? The revelation knowledge. Because then Jesus, the whole point is, he says, "Upon this rock, I will build my church." And that's when he gets into the major themes in the second half of the record: build my church, gates of Hades will not prevail, keys to the kingdom, binding and loosing. Those are all dependent upon what is this rock. So this is actually a very important segment of scripture. What is this rock? And right now, like I said, we're up to four opinions, four possible interpretations, four opinions. Number one, Peter. Number two, Jesus. Number three, Peter's confession of faith, And then number four, similar to number three, is that it's the revelation knowledge that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, the reason there's a debate here is because there is a literary device, there is a figure of speech or a pun in this verse, in verse 18, in the original languages. Now, notice I'm saying original languages, plural, right? Because that is also part of the debate, is what language were Jesus and his disciples speaking, and then also what language did, in this case, Matthew record it in. Which language, right? Because a lot of people make a big deal out of the ancient languages here, as they should. I'm not saying that's wrong. We should make a big deal out of the ancient languages to help us understand what's going on, which interpretation is correct based upon the ancient languages. So what you've got going on here is you've got a figure of speech, a pun is going on. So, because in Greek, all right, most Christians, you've been through this over and over and over again a bunch of times, but if this is new to you, here's what's going on. In Matthew 16:18, in Greek, you've got two very similar words being used. One that is actually transliterated into the name Peter, and then one that is translated into the word rock, right? So if you read it in the New King James English, like I did, verse 18 reads, "And also I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." So the name Peter is a transliteration of the Greek word Petros, and then the word rock is a translation of the Greek word Petra, right? So you have Petros and Petra. Petros is transliterated into the name Peter, and then Petra is translated into the word rock, right? And Petros, Petra, you can hear the similarity. They clearly have the same root word. So this is a play on words. This is a word game. This is a kind of pun. And you find all kinds of figures of speech and literary devices and puns all through Scripture. That's what we're going to talk about here. I'm going to show you how common these puns are, and frankly, what they're there for. There's a reason they're there. And the reason that they are there is it's to draw our attention to it. It's to draw your attention. It's to make you go, whoa, wait a second. What did you just say? What did you just say? Whoever was speaking or writing used their words very cleverly to get your attention and make you pay attention. That's the point, right? So here, the point here is you have two similar sounding and interrelated words, obviously from the same root. So, yep, pay attention. Pay attention. That's the idea here, right? Now, here's where the debate lies. There are scholars and commentators that will try to tell you that there is no distinction between Petros and Petra. And then there are scholars and commentators who will tell you, no, wait a second, that's ridiculous. Of course there is a distinction between Petros and Petra. It's two different words. It's two different genders. It's two different forms of the same word. They have two different meanings. So which is it? Right? If you have not heard this debate before, that's a legitimate question. Which is it? Because you're going to go look up all kinds of commentators who are going to say, yep, no distinction. And you're going to go look up a whole bunch of commentators that say, no, that's ridiculous. Of course there's a distinction. Which is it? Right? Well, let's start to sort this out. Right? So if you grab just your standard Bible dictionary, or a concordance, if you grab Englishman's Concordance or Strong's Concordance or something like that, this is what you are going to find. You're going to find the Greek word Petros defined as a rock, okay? And by rock, they mean something you can pick up in your hand, right? Sometimes you will hear it defined as a small rock or a pebble, and that's not incorrect, but it's not fully correct, okay? Because we can see from secular Greek use that a much larger rock can also be in view, but it's still, you can pick it up. That's the point. You can pick it up with your hands. In Homer's Iliad, in book 7, where Ajax and Hector are fighting, they each pick up a stone, a rock, and either hurl it at the other guy or hit the other guy with a rock in their hand. Ajax and Hector, both of them do it. They both pick up a Petros and hit the other guy with a rock. So a Petros can be picked up in your hand. But in that record, it even mentions the fact that Ajax managed to pick up a bigger rock than Hector did. But they're both Petros, okay? So a Petros is a rock you can pick up with your hand. Now Petra, on the other hand, and this is the distinction. A Petra you can't pick up. A Petra means a massive rock, a foundation stone or bedrock. It is immovable. That is the distinction. That's the chief distinction. A Petros is a rock, and it can be a big rock. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean pebble. Okay, it can mean a pretty darn big rock. It can mean a very heavy rock. It can mean a rock that is hard to move just as much as it can mean a rock that's easy to move. But it is movable. Okay, whereas Petra is immovable, absolutely immovable. And that's why, this is where we get, as I indicated, of the dominant opinions, one opinion is that this rock is a reference back to Peter, right? But another dominant opinion is that this rock is a reference to Jesus himself. And that comes from scriptures like this, because if we look at Matthew chapter 7 and read verses 24 and 25, it reads, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock, Petra, bedrock, right? And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock, Petra. Okay. So whenever you read this metaphor of something being founded on the rock or built on the rock, okay, it's always Petra. It's never Petros. You cannot build on Petros. You can't. You do not find that metaphor anywhere that you can build on a Petros. You can only build on a Petra. That's it. That's because Petra means a foundation stone, whereas a Petros it's a rock. It's a rock, but it's a rock you can pick up and that you can move. Okay. See, so that's where, so now, see, and some of you may already be reaching a conclusion. Well, then, how do people say that the rock can be Peter? Because Peter is called a Petros. And you just told me that you can't build on a Petros. Okay, well, that may be enough distinction right there for some people and maybe even most people. Okay, because it's in Greek, it's two different words. Now, we're going to talk about the Aramaic in a moment, because in Aramaic, it's not two different words. So that's what part of what kind of confuses the issue here, right? So, like I said, not necessarily universally, but there is an abundance of scholars and commentators who agree that this is a figure of speech. It's a figure of speech, and it's two similar and interrelated words that are intended by the speaker or the author to get the attention of the hearer or the reader, right? It's a figure of speech designed to get our attention. But then, like I said, the counterpoint, okay, is that there are some who insist that there is no difference, and that therefore Jesus is saying that he is building his church on Peter, right? See? But then there are those who say, no, there is a distinction. Jesus is building his church on this rock, and this rock is something else, probably himself, right? But maybe something else, right? So now, like I said, in Aramaic, this is a little different, right? Because in Greek, you can hear the distinction. Petros, Petra. You can hear the similarity and you can hear the distinction. Petros, Petra, right? Similar, interrelated, same root, different word, right? But in Aramaic, if you were to read it in Aramaic, it's the same identical word both times. Now, I am not an expert in Aramaic, and I have heard from different sources that this word is pronounced differently. So I'm not sure which one is accurate. But I have heard some people say that it's pronounced keepa, like as in Keepa, keepa, right? Or keepo, Keepo, keepo. I have also heard that it should be kepa or capo. I've heard all four pronunciations given forth that it's capo, right? Or capa, right? I think I'm going to stick with capa, I think, right? So we're not exactly sure, but it is the same word each time. I say unto you, you are capa, and upon this capa I will build my church. Now, so for those who want it to mean that this rock is Peter, this is where they get it, right? They say, well, no, wait a second. The Greek doesn't matter. Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic, so it's the Aramaic that matters, not the Greek. And in Aramaic, it's the same word. So here's what they'll say. I'm not saying this, they're saying this. They will say, therefore, air quotes here, Jesus is declaring that this rock is Peter because he is using the identical word in both places, right? That's the argument. And then, I'm sorry, but very typically they then throw that out and they go, see, argument over, right? Problem is, no, that's not argument over. That is not the slam dunk that you think it is, okay? Because there's frankly a lot of literary and textual considerations that go into trying to formulate an opinion and reach a conclusion here. There's actually several things we have to consider, but frankly, none of them are absolutely conclusive, right? This is a rhetorical statement, and we have to decide what is the rhetoric? What's the rhetoric behind the statement? It's not a literal statement. It's not literal, see? And so you could, I'll go this far, you could suggest that if Jesus were intending to be literal, he should have said, I say unto you, you are Peter, and upon you, Peter, I will build my church. He should have been very, very literal, not rhetorical, if he had intended to be that way. So it's like I said, it's not the slam dunk. Frankly, it's not the slam dunk either way that people would like it to be, because it's a rhetorical device, right? So, but here's some other questions we have to answer, right? The original statement, the original verbal statement, what language was it made in? Okay, because people on certain sides of the argument are going to say, well, Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic, so it was clearly made in Aramaic. Well, okay, yeah, maybe. Now, that is a reasonable conclusion. I am not challenging that conclusion. That conclusion is reasonable, but it's also not absolute. We don't know that for certain. Did Jesus speak Aramaic? Yeah, I mean, that unless something totally ridiculous is in play here, that was his native language, was Aramaic. What about Matthew, right? Because then Matthew eventually wrote it down. What about his disciples? And then what about Matthew in particular? Because in this case, it was Matthew who wrote it down. What language did they speak? Did they speak Aramaic? Yeah, pretty obvious that they spoke Aramaic. Now, but you got to ask the question, did they speak Greek? Okay. Be very careful here, because the likelihood that Jesus spoke Greek is high, and the likelihood that Matthew spoke Greek is very high. Okay. Because Jesus most likely went to work with his father Joseph in Sepphoris, a Greek city about 4, 5, 6 miles northwest of Nazareth, extensively. So he would have been exposed to it at an early age. Okay. So did he speak some Greek, or maybe even a lot of Greek? Likelihood is high. Okay. Now, Matthew, oh man, it gets even more so with Matthew, because Matthew was a tax collector for the Romans. And as an official working for the Romans, he would have either had to have had translators right with him, translating for him, or he would have had to have been able to speak multiple languages himself. Trip over my tongue there, right? So did Matthew speak Greek? Wow, highly likely that he did. So did the conversation take place in Greek? Maybe. Now, I don't think that's near as likely as Aramaic. Okay, I think that's, once again, that's reasonable. I think the likelihood is that the conversation took place in Aramaic, but it is possible that it took place in Greek. You cannot say with certainty, oh, no, they wouldn't have been speaking Greek. You can't say that, because they're also in the region of Caesarea Philippi, and the region of Caesarea Philippi was a very highly Hellenized region. Okay, very strongly Hellenized. As a matter of fact, that whole point about the gates of Hades is interconnected to that region. There is actually a specific geographic location in the region of Caesarea Philippi known as the gates of Hades. Okay, knowing how scripture tends to work, they were probably standing right in front of it when Jesus made the statement. He was probably standing right in front of the Grotto of Pan, which was a grotto, or a temple, or a shrine devoted to the Greek god Pan, and it was also known as the gates of Hades, because inside was one of the tributaries of the Jordan River, and in his day and age, they couldn't fathom the bottom of this spring. Okay, So that makes it a quote unquote bottomless pit. Okay. And it was known as the gates of Hades in the grotto of Pan. So this area, so see, that's part of the significance to the statement and significance to the record, is that it is taking place geographically next to a location known as the gates of Hades. Very, very, very provocative, right? And this was a highly Hellenized region of northern Israel. They're about 25, 30 miles northeast of the Sea of Galilee is where Caesarea Philippi was, right? So did they speak Aramaic? Yeah, they did. Did the conversation take place in Aramaic? Most likely, yes. Did they speak Greek? Probably. Did the conversation take place in Greek? Probably not, but you can't exclude it, right? Now, that's the conversation, because then when did Matthew write it down? Okay, so this is a really provocative question, is because did Matthew write it down right at that time? Did Matthew literally whip out a notebook and then write it down, right? Or did he wait? We don't know. Now, I think the former is a reasonable conclusion, that because that's who Matthew was, right? Matthew was a tax collector. He was educated. He was good at keeping records. He was that kind of guy, right? Most likely. Every indication is that that's what's going on here. So the likelihood that he whipped out parchment and pen and wrote it down, that's actually pretty darn high. See? So, but then what language did he write it in? Because did he write it in Aramaic? Yeah, probably, right? Or did he immediately translate it into Greek? Don't know. And once again, although the Aramaic is probably the more likely, you can't say definitively which he did, because we don't know. We weren't there. So we don't know. And then you get into this whole issue of, okay, well, what about the extant manuscripts that we have that are written, actual written documents that we have collected that record Matthew 16? How old are they, and what language are they in? Because the irony is that the Aramaic manuscripts, this can change. New information could come out tomorrow. So you got to be really careful when you start saying this stuff. That as of right now, according to the best information that I've been able to find, the older manuscripts are in Syriac, which is a variation of Aramaic. It's a dialect of Aramaic, right? The oldest manuscripts we have are in Syriac, not in Greek, right? So the suggestion there, right, is that it was translated from Aramaic into Greek, and therefore some people will say, well, yeah, see, so whoever wrote it down in Greek, they were taking artistic liberty, right? And that may be true, but now the question becomes, was that artistic liberty correct or incorrect? Because if it is a pun, if it is a figure of speech, they could have been translating the figure of speech that everybody understood. Everybody knew it was a figure of speech. So, yeah, I'm translating it from Aramaic into Greek, but everybody knows what it means. Everybody understands that it's a pun. So all I'm doing is making it clear in Greek, because it was clear in Aramaic, an Aramaic reader would know what it meant. So I'm just making it clear in Greek, right? But obviously the suggestion is, oh no, when they translated into Greek, they manipulated it to mean something it didn't mean. Well, you don't know that. Okay, frankly, you don't know it either way. Plus, you've got to remember, see, now, given our understanding of how we receive Scripture, right? Because this interesting record is Simon receiving revelation knowledge of who Jesus is, right? Well, 2 Timothy 3:16 is our record of how those who wrote down Scripture received knowledge of Scripture, that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God, right? Theopneustos, God breathed, right? So there's that component too, is that, was Matthew taking dictation, or did Matthew get this by revelation, or both? And did he write it down at the time or write it down later? Did he write it down and then get revelation? There's no way of knowing for sure, right? So very, very, very interesting, all of what's going on here, right? And one other quick thing here. Yes, the oldest manuscripts are in Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, but Jesus and his disciples didn't speak Syriac. They spoke Estrangelo-Aramaic, a different dialect, okay? And Syriac was a dialect of Aramaic that developed later, okay? So once again, it's not the slam dunk we want it to be sometimes, saying, well, they spoke Aramaic and, the oldest manuscripts are in Syriac and that's Aramaic. So see, there it is. End of discussion. Yeah, unfortunately, no, it's not, right? Now, I need to keep moving here because I want to get to my point. But real quick, a couple of additional insights here, because this is if this rock is Peter, this is the only place in Scripture that is referenced. There are no others. Peter is never called Petra anywhere else in Scripture. See, because you got three different Greek words now, because you've got Petros, which is translated into Peter. You've got Petra, which is translated into rock, right? Let me make sure I said that right. You got Petros, which is transliterated into Peter. Then you've got Petra, which is translated into rock. And then you've got the Greek word Kepha, okay, which is simply the transliteration of the Aramaic Kepha, right? But all three are used to describe. Wow, I almost made a fatal error there. Only two of those are ever used to refer to Peter in any place other than this Scripture alone. If, and it's a huge if, this Scripture is that this rock is Peter, then this is the only place Peter is called Petra. Peter is never called Petra anywhere else, right? Because the Greek word Petra is used 15 times in the New Testament, and it never refers to Peter, ever, right? The Greek word Petros is used 156 times in the New Testament, and it always refers to Peter. And then the Greek word Kepha, which is simply a transliteration of the Aramaic Kepha, is used 9 times, and it always is translated Cephas in anglicized in English, right? And it always refers to Peter, okay? Now, I've been making a big deal of the fact that this is a figure of speech, right? So let's talk about figures of speech here. There has been a lot of great work done into the details of figures of speech. Figures of speech are extraordinarily provocative. If you've ever looked at symbolism in Scripture and looked at the fact that, every single item in Scripture is frankly used symbolically somewhere, because like rock, right? The rock is Christ. Well, that's a symbol because it's immovable, right? But if you've ever done a study of the tabernacle or the temple, and you look at all the different materials, the different metals, the different colors, the different materials, and then if you've ever done a study of numbers, they always have symbolic meaning. Well, the same is true with figures of speech. And there's actually more than 200 different kinds of figures of speech in the Bible. Now, listen to what I just said. There's not just more than 200 figures of speech. There's more than 200 different kinds of figures of speech, right? And only one category of figures of speech are figures of speech that use repetition, okay? Figures of speech that utilize repetition. There's figures of speech that utilize comparison. So for example, a simile, a metaphor, and a hyperbole, those are all figures of speech of comparison, where you compare one thing to another, right? Well, now these are figures of speech of repetition, right? So for example, there's a figure of speech called anaphora, right? And anaphora is possibly the oldest recognized figure of speech in existence. And it's where you use the same word at the beginning of every new phrase or every new sentence, right? So you repeat the same word. So a really good example is a very famous speech by Winston Churchill during World War II, right? Where he wrote, "We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. See, so that's anaphora. We, right? Now, Matthew 16 is probably not anaphora, but that is an example of a figure of speech of repetition, right? Now, another figure of speech of repetition is called plosi, all right? Now, plosi is where you do repeat a word with intervening words in between, but usually the repeated word has a different sense, okay? So this is a maybe, but I don't think so, right? So a really good example of plosi is a very famous saying we've all heard: when the going gets tough, the tough get going, right? So you've got the word going used twice, and you've got the word tough used twice. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's plosi, right? Then you've got, but that's another, so I don't think Matthew 16 is plosi, however, right? But that's another figure of speech of repetition. Now, another figure of speech of repetition is called antinoclassis. Now, Matthew 16 might be antinoclassis. So antinoclassis is where you repeat a word in the same grammatical form, but a different meaning or sense is intended. Okay, let me repeat that. You repeat the word in the same grammatical form, but two different meanings or senses are intended, right? So like if you've ever heard this one, time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana, right? That's antinoclassis, right? Or in America, you can always find a party, but in the Soviet Union, a party always finds you, right? Those are antinoclassis. Or probably a very famous one from American history is during the Continental Congress, Ben Franklin apparently said, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall hang separately." Okay, so the word hang there is repeated. It's the same grammatical form, but two different meanings are intended. In both cases, hang is a verb, but in its first use, it means to consort with. And then in its second use, it means to be suspended by the neck until you're dead, right? So Matthew 16 may be antinoclassis, okay? But in my opinion, the winner is a figure of speech called polyptoton, right? Now, polyptoton is a Greek word. It's an English translation of a Greek word. The prefix poly means many, and then ptosis means inflection, many inflections. So polyptoton is a figure of speech of repetition of the same word with the same meaning, but in a different case, mood, sense, person, degree, number, gender, whatever, right? It's a stylistic device for the repetition of words with the same etymon, in other words, the same root within one sentence, but each time with a different inflection so as to cause a rhetorical effect. So this is very important, right? So a really good example of this is the very famous quote by Lord Acton in English history, where he said, "Power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely," right? So you've got the word corrupt used twice and the word absolute used twice. Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And this has been a figure of speech for a long time. In the Code of Hammurabi, it is written, "If a judge judges a judgment." See, there it is. 3 times in very short order, if a judge judges a judgment. Or in popular culture, see, we find it in popular culture all the time. We find it in poems and songs and political speeches and all kinds of stuff. In Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, in the musical version, they wrote a song that Fantine sings where she says, "I dreamed a dream. I dreamed a dream in time gone by when hope was high and life worth living." See, so there it is in 2 sentences. Polyptoton, sentence 1 and sentence 2, right? But the reason I bring this up is because this is apparently a Hebrew favorite, and that's why I believe Matthew 16 is polyptyton, it is a Hebrew figure of speech, right? Because let me just read off to you a list of uses of polyptyton, and this is scratching the surface. I looked this up and I found, let's see here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I found about a dozen in very quick order. Very quick order. There's going to be many, 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 many more. So like every time you hear a Hebrew phrase that says like Holy of Holies, that's polyptyton, or Heaven of Heavens, that's polyptyton. Joseph in Genesis 37, he dreamed a dream, right? Isaac in Genesis 27, it says he trembled with a great trembling, right? Leviticus talks about offering an offering, right? Or stoning him with stones, right? Or in Numbers, ready for this one? It says they lusted with lust, right? See, that's a figure of speech, right? Jesus told his disciples, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. That's polyptyton. See, so that's what this is, deliberately using a figure of speech to get your attention. And then finally, Paul writes to Timothy and he tells him to fight the good fight. See, so it's everywhere. It is all through Scripture. In Genesis 2, right? I won't go there. We'll do that some other time. But it's really, really widely used. And the whole idea here is it's drawing attention, here's the key, to the underlying idea. It's drawing attention to the underlying idea. So the question is, this rock, what is the underlying idea, right? Is it Peter? Is it Jesus? Or is it something else? Or frankly, is it all of the above? What is the underlying idea? So the underlying is not build my church, which is interesting because it says on this rock. It's funny that this rock is the underlying idea. It's the foundation, because whatever this rock is what the church is going to be built upon. So the church is not building. The church isn't the underlying idea. It's included, but it's not the underlying idea, right? Keys to the kingdom aren't the underlying idea. Included, but not the underlying idea. Binding and loosing is not the underlying idea. It's included, but it's not the underlying idea. The underlying idea in a single word, ready, is identity. The underlying idea, if you were to put forth the underlying idea in a single word, is identity. Jesus asks his disciples, who do men say I am? How do they identify me? And are they getting it right? And his disciples report, well, no, they don't. They report back at least 4 distorted viewpoints of who he is. Some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're Moses, or one of the other prophets. Men are missing it. But what does Peter do? Peter, and here's the key, by revelation, Peter properly identifies Jesus. This is the rock. This is the rock that by revelation, Peter, as an example, properly identifies Jesus. But what's even more provocative here is that then Jesus does the exact same thing back. Peter, actually Simon, right, by revelation properly identifies Jesus. And then what does Jesus do? Jesus changes Simon's name to Peter and calls him out in his true identity. He says, yep, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. You have correctly identified me. Now let me do the same for you. I say unto you, you are no longer Simon, you are now a rock. But upon this rock, the rock, okay, of properly calling each other out in your true identity. That is the rock upon which the church will be built. That we, by revelation, know who Jesus is, and that he, by revelation, calls us out for who we truly are. Who has Jesus told you? So this is really amazing, and Scripture is like this, and I love it. The part of what this verse is about here is it is as if, ready, it is as if Jesus is turning, it's as if we are asking, who do you say that I am? Right? Jesus is asking the disciples, and by implication, asking us, who do you say I am? Well, then our response to him is, well, number one, you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. But then it's also, okay, so now that I've properly identified you, will you properly identify me? Who do you, Jesus, the Son of the living God, who do you say that I am? Right? And when you get that answer, and this really, frankly, this should be part of our daily discipline, part of our daily religious, Romans 12, 1 and 2, our daily religious obligation is you should be asking Jesus, who do you say that I am? And let him tell you. Let him tell you. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is the rock upon which Christ is building his church, is our revelation knowledge of who he is, and then his revelation declaration to us of who we are. And then upon this is what builds the church. Upon this is how you operate the keys to the kingdom and binding and loosing. It's all based on identity. So there you have it. So ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap it up for today. My name is Tim Kies. You have been listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God save the King.